Hello, hello. This is Charlie Swenson. This is the podcast To Hell and Back. I think the title of this podcast might be Just Say No, or Saying No to Fascism, or How to Learn How to Say No More Effectively. That's what this is about. This is my second second consecutive podcast uh, in my own project of exploring and thinking about how to position myself in relation to the overwhelming, chaotic, uh, frenzied governmental attack on our lives as free and democratic Americans. Uh, and this one is more specifically how to generate the capacity in yourself and myself to take a position against what's happening that's active, that might make a difference, and that makes one feel not so hopeless and passive in the face of this machine. Uh, so, unlike most of my podcasts in the past, though I've done this on an occasional basis, uh, I'm going to I've written out a script, and I'm going to actually be to some degree reading it. So because I've thought of a lot of things I want to talk to you about, and I just don't want to leave them out. So let me get started. And I apologize if by reading something it makes it boring. I hate that myself, and I hope it won't turn out that way. Um, I may jump on and off the page in terms of what I'm reading. So here we go. Um, I guess one thing to start with is to tell you that within the practice of DBT, um, which is a system to try to help reduce dysfunctional behavior and a system to try to reduce suffering. And there certainly is a lot of dysfunctional behavior and suffering being generated by governmental action at this moment. Within that DBT system is a framework, a set of principles, you might say, and even a group of specific strategies for learning how to say no effectively. You may think, well, I know how to say no, but it turns out it's not so easy, and especially under certain circumstances. And for some people, they never learned to say no effectively in any situation. So I want to use that. I want to tell you about that framework and apply it. Talk about this moment in the United States. How does one say no to a train that continues to gather speed and force towards fascism in America, toward ending the American experiment, toward amplifying drastic inequalities in a system where already more than 90% of the wealth goes to a small percent of the population? How do you say no to a development more than a decade in the making that takes the rug out from under those who don't have jobs, who don't have homes, who don't have money, who live paycheck to paycheck with the jobs they do have, who are people of color, who are LGBTQ, who are immigrants trying to scrape together a life, while enhancing the lives of people, a few people with millions and billions of dollars, yachts, and jets, unlimited powers to buy elections, who already are in power and who are urgent in acquiring more, in hurting others, in dismantling democracy, in eliminating those who think out loud, who critique, who question, who treasure freedom at universities, in libraries, in schools, in the mainstream media. How do we say no to the aggressive, vicious, alarming endorsement of wealth, power, greed, and cruelty? That's what I'm thinking about. So first, let me say something about the DBT concept of dialectics before I go any further, because it's something that I think can really be misunderstood of thinking dialectically or being dialectical. I want to say what it is not and where not to apply it in this situation. In seeking balance, in seeking the middle path, so to speak, in finding what is valid on both sides of an argument, it is tempting to say something like this. Let's find out what is valid in what the current administration is doing, and let's find out what is valid in the objections to what the administration is doing, and then let's consider how to find the synthesis. I would say about this, no. That kind of dispassionate attempt to find the validity in two opposing positions, which has a place, and it has a place in treatment in DBT, it has a place in history. That in this situation could lead to a sense of whitewashing the problem, of normalizing what's going on. Uh, it could even lead to appeasement and sort of pacification. That's a misunderstanding of how to apply dialectics in this situation. Let's be real about it. In recent years, in the usual complicated, always changing, always moving situation in our country where everything depends on everything else, a project emerged which has blossomed into a powerful force aligned around Donald Trump, which has an agenda that glorifies dictatorship, that accumulates wealth among a few, that destroys the social fabric and the sort of safety network, the attack on democracy, its opposition to cooperation, opposition to morality, and opposition to sanity. Centralized among a few, it has spread to include others, namely Republicans, who have jumped on the train in spite of prior objections themselves in many cases. And so, right now, this is a train coming at us through America with every intention of bringing a fascist state with enormous inequalities, militarization, attacks on free thought, forcing polarization on purpose, identifying and attacking groups of others, so to speak, who they will blame for all problems. These are some of the defining features of a fascist state. The way dialectics works is that one position or stance or proposition or force gets going, right? And runs for a while. That is step one in a process of dialectics, and it is called the thesis. The thesis comes into being. Then that thesis elicits or brings about an opposing thesis, an opposing position, an opposing stance or proposition, an opposing force, so that once established, and established well enough, there are two relatively equal forces in opposition to each other. To my mind, in this situation where I'm applying this, we are right now in the early stage of this second step, and opposition is arising bit by bit, day by day, protest by protest, judicial decision by decision, decisions in Congress, political speech by political speech, vote by vote. It is happening, but it is still early. It is decentralized and not unified. And it's not as yet a match for bringing the fascist force to a stop, but that's where it may be headed. When it is strong enough, when it becomes strong enough, unified enough, passionate enough, effective enough, and with some leadership attached to it, to truly oppose the MAGA movement, then and only then will it make sense to invoke this idea of a dialectical search for a synthesis, a solution that honors the validity of each side, starting with finding common ground between the two positions. So let's realize realistically where we are. it is premature to be thinking dialectically in a way that somehow accidentally normalizes what's going on, normalizes the fascist urge. Where we are at now, people like me, and hopefully many of you, the job is how to say no effectively, how to stand our ground, how to find our voices, generate actions, and stop this MAGA movement in its tracks. For me, actually doing this podcast, resuming this podcast right now, has been in large part driven by my own efforts to move from being overwhelmed, uncertain, worried, to move out of being passive and on the sidelines, to find my voice and to find a way forward with more effective activity. Okay, why is this such a powerful force? This isn't just Donald Trump. So before I go into the whole framework of how to say no that I think might be applicable here, what are we saying no to? We're saying no really to what I will metaphorically describe as a 4 or 5-headed monster. Head number one, Donald Trump. Here's a man who by now it has become clear, and there's a long history of this, and a ton written about him and said about him, where his personal motivations clearly come from thinking that in his life, the playing field has been tilted against him, always. And his life is one of perpetual retribution, getting even, proving his point, all the way up to wanting to run the whole world and thinking that he has the genius to do that. His personal motivation, so, is driven by retribution, by a desire for power and for being important. He uses his resources, connections, and charisma, which he does have, in front of a crowd to maximize his importance. He seems to treat compassion and those who need compassion to be disgusting and weak. So he attacks those who are not wealthy fellow power brokers. And he glorifies those in power, especially those in dictatorship types of power, and those with extreme wealth. That's all head number one, and sort of the most important head in one respect, in that he is the figurehead. He is the point of the whole movement. He is the front man of the movement. But he ain't alone. Musk and other billionaires is sort of the second head of the monster. These are people who will benefit from a dictatorial leader who can shred regulations and embrace continued enrichment of the rich while decimating the lives of other people. There seems to be, like with Trump, a deficit in compassion that's rather stunning when you hear Musk say certain things. And then you see getting on board Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, and other billionaires who are joining the party, who are being assigned to powerful positions in the government, actually, and who are aligning with the government. Not all billionaires. There's a few that are standing out, calling out what the problems are. But that's another very powerful group. In fact, it's rather clear that there's a good chance that Trump would never have been elected without the billionaire support of Elon Musk. Third head of the monster. This mostly the one person stands out, but it's for a whole movement. And that person is Stephen Miller. And this is what you might call the rabid anti-immigration head of the monster. The search for purification of America by getting rid of and blocking out and deporting all immigrants, and a few more people along with them. Um, as you've probably seen with Stephen Miller, there's a certain insanity to this head of the monster when he's on television, which he seems to like to do. He goes into rants that are almost unstoppable. There is a kind of a insane force behind the anti-immigration movement that's part of the monster. And of course, this movement also benefits from having a dictatorial leader who can drive out immigrants and support all of those efforts to do that, no matter what the cost. The fourth head of the monster, let's just call it the Project 2025 head. This is the project to dismantle the civil service of our country, the administrative state that keeps things going with some degree of stability and consistency from one administration to another. And all of that dismantling, and there's huge other parts to it, are largely in the service of trying to build a white Christian nationalist state, some kind of additional purification of America to approximate as if people of color never came, people with uh, other than standard cisgender people don't have a place, and it's white, and it's Christian, and it's sort of modeled after Hungary with Viktor Orban, also with echoes of Russia with Putin, and China with Xi Jinping. There might be a fifth head to this monster that isn't quite at the same level of influence, but has been surprisingly influential and joins in some of the insanity. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, with his insanity about vaccines and autism and fluoride and certain other things, even though there are some reasonable approaches too, wants to bypass and degrade the science of healthcare, and not surprisingly, to empower himself and enrich himself in the process. And not to mention to show himself off working out whenever possible. There's a kind of a self-importance of this whole group. Of all of these heads of the monster, the Project 2025 is interesting because it's probably the least visible, the least outspoken. There's no evidence of people standing up and speaking for it, even though, like for instance, J.D. Vance has been a big proponent of Project 2025. But mostly it's sort of the bill refashioning the whole infrastructure of America in a disciplined, step by step, out of public view kind of way. And other than J.D. Vance, who isn't really quite the leader of it, but he's an important figure in it, given who he is as vice president. But it's Russell Vought, who is the leader of the Office of Management and Budget, and who is and it was really driven also by the Heritage Foundation. So that's the five-headed, six-headed, whatever number-headed monster it is that is combining its forces and combining extraordinary wealth and power and a very harsh and uncompassionate approach to the whole thing, and coming like a freight train. And that makes it really hard to say no. So let me get back now, having sort of laid the groundwork for this, to say, okay, let's assume that it would be very important for people in unity and in all kinds of different ways, and all at the same time, to get up and say no and put a stop to what's going on in a way that maybe has just begun to be modeled a little bit by the ways that Harvard responded to attacks on the university, that other universities are joining into that. Um, that some law firms are refusing to capitulate to Trump. So there is definitely here and there, and I think with greater frequency week by week, kind of growing voices in the opposition. Courage is growing. People are finding their footing. So let's talk about how each of us says no. Um, let's break it into two projects because it really is two projects learning to say no. The first one has to do with generating and having the motivation to say no because in DBT, there is this concept that if you're going to change behavior, there has to be motivation to change behavior, and then there has to be the capability of changing behavior. Now, sort of what's the skill base for changing a behavior? So let's look at the motivation, and then we're secondly going to look at the skill, in this case, of saying no effectively and trying to apply it to this situation. So regarding motivation, um, I learned over the course of, I guess I've taught DBT skills for nearly 35 years. And it occurred to me somewhere way back, but not at the beginning, because I was sort of passionate about teaching the skills and excited about that. And I saw some changes that were very encouraging. But I realized that actually no one ever learns a skill, DBT skill or any kind of skill. No one ever learns a skill unless one feels the need for it. You don't just learn the skill of baking bread unless baking bread has come to be something that you kind of feel like you need to have as part of your life. Um, any other skill works the same way, right? And so when it comes to learning to say no, um, if you feel that it's a necessity to stand up to the fascist machine in whatever way you can and object to it, which is sort of like saying no to it, and you want to do that, you might need to increase your motivation to get yourself to do it because it's going to be hard to actually end up doing it against such a powerful force, right? So this usually means um, motivation is often tied to emotions. And so this means experiencing the emotions that would drive you to need to say no. Standing on the sidelines, living life as usual in our own lanes, hearing terrible things going on through news items or online posts, but sticking close to home, doing what we usually do, hearing the hoofbeats of fascism going on not far away, but not quite in our own lane yet, might be enough to upset us, but might not be enough to motivate us to action. Let me give a couple of examples of people who were not saying no to something, but who then did say no to something because of the emotions that came about, and learn from these. How did they do it, and what does it take? The first story is going to be one where I'm a central player in the first story because it was something that happened between me and my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law was a particularly critical, harsh, at times abusive person, verbally, emotionally, towards my wife as she grew up and even into adulthood. And it sometimes was stunning the kind of things she would say to my wife and criticizing her or making fun of her and then say that it was all just a big joke and she was just being funny when it was clear it was way more than just being funny. So I was on the sidelines of this for years. And my wife was hurt by it, upset about it, and it was something she worked on in her life in a very diligent way to try to come to terms with this, to try to stand up to her mother, to try to block out her mother at times, to try to walk away from her mother, and to give herself permission, which also helped when there were a couple of other people who gave her permission to just stop having contact with her. But while contact was going on, and I was therefore also having contact with her mother, one thing that complicated things further was that her mother kind of idealized me. And she would talk about me as if I was great and I was fine. And then my wife was lucky to have me rather than uh, the other way around. Um, and so I knew she was upsetting. I thought she was upsetting. I felt, of course, my wife was unhappy with her, but it did lead to some conflicts in my relationship with my wife because I just didn't seem to get it. From her point of view, I was the golden boy and I was standing on the sidelines. And while I could sympathize with her, she felt that I didn't really get it, that I really interacted with her mother in a way that normalized her mother, that appeased her mother, that really didn't raise up the level of trouble that her mother was causing and really oppose it. And that was all true. I don't think I thought that at the time. I wrestled with that and it was painful. But then one incident happened that changed everything. And it's a good lesson for what I'm talking about today. We were at a bat mitzvah of our niece. Um, and it was around the time that my older son was probably something like 1 year old. He was at the whatever, he was at the age when mostly we're carrying him around in situations like that. And then he's running around on the floor a little bit. Yeah, so he was probably 1 years old. So there we are, and we're with a whole table of people that are eating together, and part of this whole ceremony of the bat mitzvah, which was really wonderful. And 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 I'm holding my son. And then something starts going on in the next room, which is a kind of ceremonial part of a bat mitzvah, where different people are going to get up and say certain things. I'm sorry for those of you who are Jewish. I don't remember the name of what that part of the bat mitzvah is. You're probably knowing it right now and saying, why doesn't he know that? Um, so I took my son and I said to people at the table, I'm going to take him next door and we're going to go where this ceremony is going on because I would like to see it. At that moment, my mother-in-law, who's across the table from me, says, no, you're not. And I said, well, yes, I am. What do you mean, no, I'm not? You're not going to take him in there right now when we're all having a meal here together. You're just not going to do that. And she said it in the harshest way, as if she totally dismissed who I was and that I had a voice in this situation. And I was just directly in the line of fire of a type of fire I had seen 1,000 times, but it had never been directed at me. And I was so enraging at that moment. I was so angry just immediately by her trying to block my way to do something that, of course, I could do and I wanted to do. Um, and I said, well, I forget what I said to her. I said something very pointed at her, posing her and telling her, of course, I'm going next door, and et cetera, et cetera. And then when we were driving her home, maybe 2 hours later to her house, um, she was in the back seat of the car, and I was boiling mad still. And I said to her, I just want to let you know about the incident tonight when you said I shouldn't take my son to the next room. I just want you to know that if you ever, ever, once, ever talk to me that way again, you will never, ever see your grandson again. Is that clear? And there was nothing was said. And I said, is that clear? And I really just took this extreme hard line position, which was not the way I had ever talked to her before. And she said yes. And in fact, she never did that to me again. And it changed the nature of our relationship. It made me feel empowered. It made me feel terrible about how I had missed what it was like for my wife to be in her line of fire ever since she was a little girl. And really it improved things over time between me and my wife. And it gave me a clearer position in relation to my mother-in-law. So that was story number one. And to me, the take-home lesson there is that we can be quite upset about abusive behavior from the sidelines. But until you're in the line of fire, it doesn't generate the same level of emotionality. That emotionality, which gives you a surge of being able to say no much more effectively, much more effectively. I mean, I had had conversations with my mother-in-law before about the way she treated my wife, and I was critical of her, but nothing like this. This was taking a really hard line, and it had, I mean, fear generates the ability to say no. Fear interferes with the ability to say no, and anger generates the ability to say no. And so getting those emotions going can be helpful to taking a much more forceful and effective stance. Story number two. This is a story that took place on my inpatient DBT program in the early days of applying learning DBT and applying DBT. And going through I was running a skills group that day myself. I think it had about six patients in the group. And I was having everybody practice saying no. But there was this one person, her name was Laura, who couldn't say no. And the scenario was this. I was going around from group member to group member saying, I'm going to ask you for money now, and I want each of you to say no. In whatever way you want to say no, I want you to say no to me. Okay. So, and then I would ask each of them for $5. Could I have $5, please? And somebody would say, no, no, you can't. And say, okay, that was a good job. The next person, could I have $5, please? I asked somebody else and she said no. So I could really use it to take a bus ride and I'll pay you back tomorrow. Would that be okay? The next person paused but said, no, I really can't afford to give you that money. I said, okay, that was a good job. And we went around person by person, said no. Each person said no differently. They got practice just saying the simple, supposedly simple skill of saying no. It turns out it's not simple at all, depending on the circumstances. And I get to Laura and I said, so Laura, could you give me $5? And Laura says, of course, Dr. Swenson. And I said, no, Laura, you're supposed to say no. We're practicing saying no. So let's do that one again. Okay, Laura, could I borrow $5 from you? I could really use it to take a bus ride. I really need it. And she paused and then she said, well, I don't know why I would say no. That sounds, of course, I'll give you money. And then we did it a third time. And the third time she said something like, well, I do have the money. And so, of course, I'll give it to you. And I said, Laura, you really can't say no? I mean, and she wasn't joking, by the way. There was nothing humorous about this. And other than telling it one step removed sounds a little funny, but it wasn't funny at the time. It felt like, oh my God, I felt like we were looking into the Grand Canyon of a skills deficit and seeing that she cannot say no, even in this situation. And then thinking about her history, which included that she was never able to say no to people, and in particular to men who took advantage of her and hurt her time after time after time, and that was part of her pathology was that she had had PTSD from having been mistreated terribly as a child and then being unable to say no to people. And so we had hit on the skill that was right at the core of the depth of her psychology. So, so we then worked on, so I said, well, look, how can we work on getting you to say no? And one of the other group members who knew her, because they were all in the hospital together, so they would get to know each other. One of the advantages of hospitalization, among all of the disadvantages for treatment. This other woman said, I know how Laura can say no. I said, well, so in what, how? And she turned to Laura and she said, Laura, let's imagine that you have a 5-year-old girl and you've taken that 5-year-old girl to the playground and she's on the swings and she's having a good time and you're watching over her. And a strange man comes up who you've never seen before and says to you, I'm going to be taking your daughter home with me. And as soon as this other patient said this and said, this is what I want you to imagine, Laura said, no, you're not. And I thought, wow. I said, well, you really did. You really knew. Well, why do you think she could say no under those conditions? She said, because Laura can say no on behalf of a child and another person, but she can't say no on behalf of herself because she doesn't feel like she's worth it. I said, oh my God. And we started to working. That wasn't the moment to work on the deeper question of her lack of self-worth, which her treatment was all about. But it was about how to say no, which would be one step in the direction of trying to generate a feeling of being empowered and a feeling of being worthwhile. So we started working on saying, okay, we tried it this way, we tried it that way. And she started to be able in the group to say no under certain circumstances, as long as she did an imaginary exercise that she was doing it on behalf of somebody else, including even the child within herself, as long as she could think separately about that. So she started saying no in the group, which felt like a big improvement. And she practiced it. And then we wanted her to work on being able to say no beyond the group. So we had a homework assignment that she would say no at least once a day on the inpatient unit to somebody. So literally, one of the things that happened the next day was she was in line in the morning, 8 in the morning, time to come get your medications line, where the nurse is handing out people's medications and they're taking their meds. And it gets to Laura, and when the nurse says, "Here's your meds," and hands her her medications, and Laura says, "No, thank you." And it was like stunning to the nurse. Like she'd never heard her say no before, and she couldn't believe how Laura was always went along with things. And she said, "No, Laura, this is a doctor's order. You need to do this." And she said, "No, thank you. I'd rather not have my medications today." And the nurse was very exasperated and said, "You have to. We're going to have to report this to the doctor if you don't take your medication." And she said, "No, I rather not take them today, maybe tomorrow." And there was a patient from the group that had been there the previous day when we were working on this project and was standing behind Laura in line. And when Laura did this, was leaning over and from behind Laura's head saying to her rather quietly, "Good job, Laura. Hang in there. You can do this," and really supporting her. So the whole step-by-step process, which kind of previews for you what are the three steps of saying no effectively, are in this story. Step one is going to be the ability to acquire the skill, which is to make sure you've got it. So she had it when it was put a certain way by her fellow patient about looking after her daughter. So she acquired the skill, you might say. So many people already have the skill of saying no, but she acquired the ability to do it, especially with some passion, some emotion. And then the next step in learning a skill is to practice, 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 practice. So then she just kept practicing in different ways in the group. We made this a project of the whole group that people were learning to say no. And Laura in particular was actually learning to say no and practicing saying no. So that's step number two, and that's called strengthening the skill. So you acquire the skill as step one, and you strengthen the skill as step two by practicing, practicing. And we're going to break this down a little further in a minute because I think the skill of saying no to a fascist movement, uh, you know, is another level of difficulty. Though I must say, Laura's level of difficulty was pretty high. And then the third step is to generalize the skill where it's most needed in your life. And so in Laura's case, that was, at least at that moment, to be using it beyond the group and in the inpatient setting. And so there's ways you help to generalize a skill. And so she started generalizing the skill to talking to the nurses and other people in the inpatient unit. And within a couple of weeks, Laura was pretty good at saying no about all kinds of things, which made some people quite happy and others not happy at all. Okay, so so to borrow from these stories, to be motivated to say no effectively, this is the motivation part, up against the several-headed fascist monster that I was talking about, may require either experiencing yourself as being in the line of fire, which could generate your emotional response and make it more forceful and effective to say no. Or you could be from the sidelines when you're not in the line of fire. You might be able, like Laura did, to vividly imagine the destructive force of this several-headed monster being applied against vulnerable populations or people that you care about as individuals or groups. Maybe imagining what this regime is going to do to the lives of your children over many years, to the lives of vulnerable beings in our country and outside of our country that are affected already by this. What it will do to damage the relationships with other parts of the world, other countries, and really also what it may do to cause the extinction of the planet Earth, given the position related to climate change, the non-scientific and really devastating position related to climate change. So, okay. So those are a couple of lessons from those stories. Being in the line of fire, which you might be able to do some things to get yourself into the line of fire, which might then get you able to say no effectively because you'll actually feel what you feel rather than just imagining it. Or if you're on the sidelines, imagining what this is doing more vividly, really bringing it to mind, really identifying with people who are being devastated and who will be devastated by this regime. And maybe that might generate motivation. So now let's say there's motivation. Someone has motivation. How do you say no? All right. So I've already told you these 3 steps. Sometimes they're called principles of skills training, and they come from way beyond the world of DBT. I mean, the principles of skills training have been worked out a long time ago, and these 3 principles apply to the acquisition, strengthening, and generalization of almost any skill in life. So step 1 is the acquisition of a skill. Step 2, once a skill is acquired, which Marshall Linehan defined as somebody can perform the skill at least once effectively under ideal conditions, where you have a lot of support and reinforcement and instruction. So step 2, once it is acquired, is the practice of a skill, to strengthen it by using it again and again and again, ideally in a situation where you can get feedback from somebody else who can give you validation that you are using the skill correctly and give you coaching suggestions for improving it. So step 2 includes practice, 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 which in behaviorism is called behavioral rehearsal, and along with coaching and feedback. And now you've got the skill in your repertoire is stronger. Now you take it where it's most needed in your life, wherever that is, whatever that is. And then and so you need to generalize the skill. So that's the third step, a third principle, is generalization of the skill to environments where it's most needed. And that begins with really imagining where it's going to be needed and imagining what the difficulties are going to be in doing that, which is called generalization programming. You're kind of getting ready for generalization of the skill, starting to identify the factors that are going to make it really hard to use where you need it. And so you can begin to use another skill in DBT called coping ahead to really do an imaginary set of solutions of what you're going to do when you get in that situation where you need it. And so that may be a useful part that we'll come back to when it comes to using the skill of saying no in the circumstance we're talking about it. Okay. So, step one, let's start with step one. How do we acquire a skill? This is again from the more general skills training principles. If we don't have a skill yet, how do we acquire it? And the emphasis there is on it helps to have really good instructions of how to do a skill, like step-by-step sequential instructions. There's such a thing as people who are really good at giving instructions and people who are not so good at giving instructions. So getting good instructions for a skill, but by itself, instructions is often not enough. The other component is modeling, seeing how someone does it, hearing how someone does it, watching on YouTube how somebody does it, um, um, hearing somebody explain to you how they do it and what it's like for them to do it. So instructions is one thing, and modeling is another. And between the two, it helps you acquire most skills in life. So, um, so uttering the word no uh, is sounds simple when you first say it, but you know what I learned about the skill of saying no, and actually so many skills that sound simple, when you actually need to do them, it's not simple at all. Because to say no effectively means you want to have a facial expression that goes along with saying no. You want to have a tone of voice that goes along with saying no. You want to have body posture that goes along with saying no. You want to read your situation actively when you're saying no, accurately when you're saying no, so you're perceiving how it's being received and how to adjust to that situation. So and then just getting the words to come out of your mouth can sound, and when you're frightened. So how do you say no in the face of internal opposition, like emotions that tell you, no, don't say that, be afraid. No, you're not, you shouldn't say no. And then you feel afraid. So, how do you say no, even if you're afraid of saying no? So, all of those things have to be taken into account. So, it's difficult. So, giving instructions on saying no might take those things into account. It may be valuable to really anticipate and think through what it's going to take to say no and ask other people, how do you do it? Or maybe even have a class in this. I mean, you might say this podcast at the moment is serving as a bit of a class in this, but how do you utter the word no and the accompanying words of effectively opposing something, even in the face of opposition and all of these other things, even when your knees are shaking and you feel you're going to throw up? How do you say no? Um, and the modeling, how do you get the modeling? Of course, you see other people say no, but this kind of skill of saying no is very, very important to have modeling if you're not very good at it. You need models you can hear, you can see, you can be around, you can draw from. People who say no in a variety of kinds of situations. It's contagious when people say no, and you've seen it a lot, that you can do it too. It's imitative. You can do it too. It's infectious. You even feel like doing it sometimes. And you might like someone and they say no. You admire someone, they say no. You watch people on TV or in movies or in theater or on YouTube, and you can see how they're saying no. How can you fight? How do you say no to the opposition when it's an opposition like this? No, I asked one of my sons last night in anticipating this, what movie would he watch if he was trying to get himself stronger at saying no or standing up to a very big force? And he immediately said, oh, Rocky, one of the Rocky movies. He said, particularly the Rocky movie when he fought the gigantic and frightening Russian dude. It's like, oh my God, I remembered that. Yes, Rocky had to somehow get himself ready to fight when he knew he might just be knocked out by this powerful boxer. I think of movies, I can't think of a name of one right now, but there's movies like that have whistleblowers that try to stand up against enormous forces like the tobacco industry the companies in the tobacco industry and trying to reveal to the world that they are doing destructive things. They're causing cancer in people's lives, and they're denying that they're doing that. And there are a lot of movies like that about that and other thing like toxic chemicals in the environment. There's a movie about that. There's books about that. There's novels about that, about stories about these kinds of things. So I think to model yourself after something you're seeing, you're hearing, you're reading about, you're learning about, where it really requires a lot to stand up. Just hearing those stories and seeing people do it can help you. Also, if you start going, if you haven't done much of this, but if you start going to demonstrations or protests, you see all kinds of people practicing saying no. I mean, protests, some people write off protests as well, it's not going to do anything. But you know what it does? It generates the development of skills. It generates motivation and it's contagious. And when you hear other people shout certain slogans or chants or certain ways of saying no to a fascist regime, then you can kind of take these into yourself and think, oh, you realize you could say that too. You might even join in there and start practicing. So you're in the second step of skills training, which is to strengthen it by practicing. So going to demonstrations or watching things or watching people give speeches these days that are really effective can help yourself find models for saying no or for saying other ways of objecting to what's going on. And so, you might really look, and in looking for instructions, it's not as easy to just find, it's not as clear that you can find places where people can instruct you to do these things. But the organizations like Indivisible or Hands Off or the ACLU and other organizations probably do have, they might not call it skills training, but probably do skills training on how to protest, how to object, how to fight, and how to say no. So, anyway, and I think lately, been a little bit encouraging, even though I think it's pretty early and it won't take hold yet for a while across the board. But there are people who are starting to find their voice and watch other people with their voice. Like, this whole tour of town halls that Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have been doing, that 10, 20, 30,000 people come out. So people are very interested in it. And the two of them are very good at finding a voice, have been doing it for a while. It's part of what they're good at. As progressives, is really taking a stance and really stating it. And if you go to their speeches or if you watch their speeches, it could give you a little bit of practice or a modeling to get going. And there are other people who've been doing things. Cory Booker with his extremely lengthy speech in the Senate, and Chris Murphy, a senator in Connecticut that's been very outspoken and has been articulate about this. Just this last weekend, J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, gave a stirring opposition speech in New Hampshire. I recommend that you find it, that you read it or watch him on YouTube doing that speech. And he's going around doing more things. And he's a particularly articulate voice that really can be a good model. Reading speeches by people like by Martin Luther King, by Gandhi, by certain speeches by Abraham Lincoln, and probably hundreds of other people. There's a world filled with models that you can start to, um, look at and see what you can draw from. Okay. And then I think I've implied this already, but beyond just specific instructions and modeling, just going and being with other people that are trying to stand up to the machine. Um, you can borrow passion, you can borrow motivation, and you can borrow skills, and you can borrow ways of saying no, and you can borrow ways of articulating your own voice. You can find your own voice better by being among other people who are doing it and then stepping back from that than just being by yourself. Okay, so let's say you've acquired the skill of saying no. You've done it at least once under optimal circumstances. The second principle of skills training is to strengthen the skill. So that means rehearsing it in your mind, practicing it in various situations in reality with other people, and it will grow in strength. So ideally, along with that, you try to get feedback from other people if you do speak out somewhere or you write something or you try to articulate these things and push back. Maybe you can get feedback from other people that tell you what was effective about what you did and what would make it better. So getting feedback, getting coaching along with practicing is what strengthening skills is all about, whatever type of skill it is. You know, you're in your mind, you're coping ahead maybe sometimes, like you're thinking, I'm going to go to such and such, and I'm going to stand up and say something at a town meeting. I'm going to say something at a school committee. Next time somebody says something to me that I object to, I'm going to object to it. I object to what they say out loud. So you try this first in the shower. You try this as you drive your car. You try this when you're walking your dog. You imagine what you would say to somebody in these situations to oppose them. You write letters to people in the government, which helps you find your voice. You call and leave voicemails for politicians. Any chance to speak up here or there could be another opportunity to help you refine your voice, find your voice, and gain confidence in saying things and standing up and saying no. So you'll learn to act, another DBT skill, act opposite your fear, because it would be natural in these situations to be afraid of how you're going to be responded to, either in the moment or in a bigger way. If somebody was going to target you because you started to speak up against the regime. And so these situations, mostly you will gain confidence by doing these things and finding out you can do it. You can speak up, and it might cause you some trouble. But as John Lewis would say, and former congressman and a civil rights leader, it'll be good trouble, the kind of trouble that actually is good. It's good for you. It's good for the country. So you learn to act opposite your fear because your fear is telling you to back off, be quiet, go away, lay down, put it out of your mind, and pray for the best. All of these ways of avoiding uh, being directly in the line of fire. So this will help you act opposite your fear. So now you need to be trying it, practicing it, doing it with others, even having conversations with other people about what's going on in the government and how you feel about it. It may just seem like, oh, you're just rehearsing, or you're just repeating talking points that you read or you heard on television or something like that. But actually, you are finding your own voice when you do that, which is going to put you in a better place to take another step in this massive fight that's shaping up. Uh, Far too slowly, given that the fascist machine got going so quickly, starting January 20th. Well, way before that, but the official inauguration date. So anyway, rehearse things how you might oppose somebody in a conversation. Imagine a conversation with someone you know who you don't agree with. Imagine how you would oppose them, counter their arguments. Try it out. Maybe try it out when you're also with somebody else who's on your team. Okay, so now let's say you've acquired the skill of saying no, and now you've gotten getting stronger at doing it in different situations. You're getting some reinforcement from people, you're getting some feedback from people around you about it, and you're starting to feel, okay, I'm getting this. Now you increasingly want to bring that skill into situations where it's going to matter the most. That's called generalizing the skill to the most relevant environments. First, you identify those environments. Like, where do you want to go? Where do you want to be? Where do you want to speak up if you do? How do you want to say no? Maybe you're the kind of person who needs to say no by writing letters or needs to say no in a group by being with other people who do it. Maybe you're the kind of person who likes to stand up and speak out in a public meeting or in a conversation. So it can be a large space, a small space. It could involve nobody in particular or lots of people. So this weekend, for instance, I'll be going to a small demonstration. I don't think it'll be small, but each demonstration I've gone to has been bigger than I expected, and which is really good. And I'll be going to one this weekend that's basically in honor of May Day, May 1st, but though it'll actually be on May 3rd, because May 1st is on Thursday. It doesn't sound like much to go to a local protest, but actually it's another step. It's another venue, another place to practice, another place to take it where it matters, to actually join the opposition actively, practicing saying no out loud and finding various ways to do that. And if you do that, then you never know what you're going to run into. You might find somebody who says, "Hey, let's go do this," or "Can you come with me to such and such a meeting?" And you start to find your place little by little. Um, okay. So by this point, if you start to go to situations where it matters, you're generalizing the skill. You've now acquired, strengthened, and generalized the skill of saying no in different ways in different settings, over and over, here and there, case by case, and with growing expertise. And to take on a machine like this, which is threatening to attack and destroy the lives of anyone who gets in the way, is truly daunting and frightening. Not if you're in a small protest with a group of like-minded people, but anywhere other than that you're going to go, or if you're going to take a stance at your job or in a school or at a protest where there's actually intense disagreements going on, or something else. So it's understandable that people want to stay on the sidelines, stay out of the light, and not make oneself a target. So I'm hoping that even in one case, one person who listens to this podcast will think, "Oh, I can do that. I have that skill of saying no in certain situations. I could generalize it to this other situation. I can strengthen it. I can do it again and again." Because if everybody does it, if everybody starts doing it and gets better at doing it, and it spreads across the country. And by the way, it's not trivial even now. The last a couple Saturdays ago, which was the last sort of like announced nationwide set of protests, there were about 3 million people that came out, including in all kinds of states that are primarily Republican states when the people vote. There were about 3 million people. That's like 1% of the population of our country is already coming out. And the 10, 20, 30,000 people that are coming out to these town halls with Bernie and AOC, there is a strong movement happening, and you can imagine that of those 3 million people that came out, there's another few million probably that know those people that just didn't make it or didn't come or weren't that motivated or were afraid about actually being at a protest, never done it before. So it's kind of like we're just getting our legs under us to try to oppose what's happening as effectively as possible. So anyway, I hope that this podcast was interesting to you for one reason or another, either learning something further about DBT or about your own life, or in particular about this topic I was talking about today, which you'll probably still be continuing to talk about. But so please let me know what you think. Let me know how this podcast landed in you. You could send me an email at my email address, which is c.robert.swenson@gmail.com. You could go to my website, charlieswenson.com, and leave me an email through the website. You could leave a comment wherever you find this podcast. So I would really look forward to hearing from you, know how it landed for you. So it'll also help me get feedback as I try to strengthen my own voice in this area. So have a good week, and I'll hopefully talk to you again if you're interested. All right. Uh, that's it. Bye bye.